Hello, and welcome back to Coffee with Curators. I am the assistant curator at Riverviews Artspace, Meg Weston.
And I'm curator Brooke Marcy. We work at Riverviews Artspace, a nonprofit arts organization in downtown Lynchburg, Virginia, that's dedicated to exhibiting contemporary art in our galleries and making contemporary art accessible to our community. This podcast is just one way we hope to connect our audience with our artists beyond our exhibits, in this case, our programs, because today we have an artist of a different media with us. April is National Poetry Month, and Riverviews Artspace has an annual program called Burg, where we share the poetry of local poets, both publicly and online, on our website. So, yay!
Our guest today is Lynchburg's own Hannah Cohen. She has an MFA from Queen's University of Charlotte, and she's been published in several poetry journals and magazines and has had nominations for Best on the Net and a Pushcart Prize. She's also a loving cat mother of two. So welcome, Hannah, for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me on here. I'm glad to do something again for Lynchburg and the art community here. So especially the written word community, I guess.
Yes, you're our first artist that is not a visual artist on our podcast. So that's fun.
Well, I think the text and words and writing is still visual. You engage with it, on the page. So yeah, it's just an artist of a different type.
Yeah, definitely. So
absolutely. I used to ask all my students who are writers. I was just always really curious what their answer would be. When you're writing, do you envision pictures? Do you hear sound? And I've had people respond and they see text, they see visual imagery, and they just hear sound. Mm-hmm. So when you mentioned that, it brought up that I'd totally forgotten that I do that. I had done that. So when you write, what do you see in your head?
Yeah, I do think a lot about when I'm writing something. I tend to think about like certain images that kind of come to mind or feelings. A lot of it is mostly feeling based, emotion driven, a lot of kind of textural sort of moments. I think when people try to sit down and write a poem, they try to like go dive first into like the image, but I find that sometimes a little bit overwhelming and not really sometimes how you want to start, like, cracking the old poetry muscles, so to speak, especially if you haven't written poetry in a while. So, I think it's important to kind of think about, what kind of like immediate first impressions. So I think sounds, like certain music, definitely I think of when I'm starting to write something, emotions, again, that kind of like texture of experience.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I went out of order of our questioning too. Okay, Meg, hit her with the percolator. It was just when you talked, it just absolutely reminded me. I was like, oh my gosh, I used to ask all of my students who are writers, because I'm a visual artist. So I was like, what do you see when you write? Okay, back to the percolator. Sorry, Meg, couldn't resist. I got sidetracked. I'm so easily sidetracked, you'll notice that. And I also ramble. Okay.
Brooke, you act like it's easy for us to stay in order when we can just jump around really in any moment. So I'm not too worried about the order of things.
Okay.
Yes, the percolator, our icebreakers part of the coffee-themed podcast.
Is there a fish in that percolator?
No.
Twin Peaks reference.
Oh, I am vastly unprepared for any Twin Peaks reference.
Oh, well.
So sorry to let you
down. This was a fun podcast, but I gotta go. No.
Yeah, sorry. We could just stop it here.
No. Sorry, it is a stupid joke.
No worries. So Hannah mentioned when I invited her on the podcast that she has a chai tea latte addiction. So what is it about the chai tea latte that draws you in and makes you choose it over coffee?
I like the spices of it, and that it's, I think chai, people think of like a generic like chai blend, but if you actually like go to tea shops, or, even if you even go to Starbucks and add like, a dirty chai, which I usually sometimes will split between like a chocolate espresso. So like there's a little bit of coffee, but I don't drink it straight. Or like toffee, like the toffee nut syrup that they have is really good. But a lot of times if you get like different blends, like I once had like a chai with a Earl Grey blend, or like a vanilla, or like kind of things that make it a little bit more earthy. I really like matcha for the same reason. It's very like down to earth. It's not super sweet. Like real matcha, as in drink it straight from like a giant bowl matcha. Like
Yes, I
it's
mean,
not.
I love matcha too. And then, have you ever seen anybody drink matcha that hasn't had matcha before? The look on their face. Oftentimes, they're like, "Oh my God, I'm drinking seaweed
Or grass. That's
or
kind of
grass."
I mean, it's not, I guess it's either an acquired taste or a taste not for everyone, but as someone that really likes earthy, you know, spice, not traditionally like sweet or tangy teas, I tend to find myself drinking those more often, because it's not like immediately, sugar rush power,
Yeah, sometimes you get a chai tea latte and it is just straight soup, like just syrup. And
Yeah, I
I'm
don't
just
like
not a
that.
fan. I like it when it's more like cinnamon and spicy.
Anise, yeah, you have
Yeah.
like a little bit of like
Oh yeah.
maybe, you know, other spices in there that isn't just sweet. So yeah, that's kind of the story. I regularly get chai from Starbucks with usually like a shot of something else in it, so it's not just like sweet drink.
Right.
And their matcha I actually do kind of like, but it's kind of hard to find like an organic matcha that you can't just buy like the powder or literal, I guess, grass from.
The grass.
Yeah.
Well, since we've already deviated, I'm going to deviate from my other question because you kind of already talked about like your preference of chai tea. But did we found through this podcast that a lot of people pick up their caffeine addiction during grad school? Did you find that you also had that kind of
You
intake?
know, I actually kind of stopped drinking coffee around grad school. I actually drank it more at like when I was at community college, like, and I had earlier classes. Sometimes when I was at, my regular undergrad, Randolph. But in general, I've never really been like a huge like coffee drinker. No, with chais, yeah, I would say I definitely increased my intake like around grad school. I guess you could say that. There was a Starbucks on campus, at like a Starbucks run coffee shop on campus at Queens. So, all the writers were there lined up at trying to get their fix before the other like residential Queen students could. So it was always like this battle of like the grad students and the residential, like when we were there for the summer anyway, like just constantly trying to get there before they other students would.
Cool. So the last question in the percolator is who would you sit and share your tea with, living or dead, whether you know them or not? Who is your talking buddy at a
Yeah,
salon
my
or
chai
cafe?
tea date.
Dream date, that could be fun.
Dream date. Oh gosh, well, we don't want to go down that avenue. I don't know. I think I actually have a portrait of, I think maybe having like chai with W.B. Yeats here. I think that would be really interesting, because he was into like all the weird, kind of woo-woo automatic writing stuff. And of course, he is one of my favorite poets, Irish poet. I've always really admired his canon of work. And I think just, I don't know, having like a 30-minute conversation with him would be pretty cool. I mean, he definitely is like a man of his time, I guess, but I don't know, pretty influential. And again, it would just be kind of interesting to listen to him and hear him talk about like what he was doing at his time, like a lot of like some political poetry about Ireland, obviously, and kind of the ongoing strife there, I think can be definitely related to now. So yeah, I think that would be nice tea and biscuits, I guess, with him. Maybe not biscuits. He was Irish. Never mind.
Perfect. It sounds like a good time.
insulting him beyond the grave. So
Well, you really can't do much about that, Kenny.
yeah.
All right. Well, that was fun. It's always fun. I like it. I get tickled anytime we do the percolator.
No, they're always good. So my first question for you is, when did you start writing poetry?
Oh Lord. I mean, in general, I guess I started writing when I was really like a lot of other, I guess, writers. It's pretty cliche to say that they started writing at a young age, and that's true for me. I think like poetry, I wrote like a couple poems in like elementary and middle school. And then it really wasn't until like, the dreaded high school teenage angst years where I started writing like really angsty poetry, I think as most writers do, especially during that time. But I think like seriously, as in I would like to write poems and publish them, as part of my interest in this career slash publishing kind of record. Definitely like in college was when I got more and more serious. So yeah, poetry, but I think I'd always like written a lot of like fiction when I was younger, and yeah, it's just been kind of a lifelong thing I've done for God knows how long. But yeah, I would say around like early college, but then also like started writing it more aggressively in high school. all the emo goth punk fueled lyrics of yesteryears.
Do you ever revisit those?
God.
Or actually revisit one and rewrite one with a totally different perspective?
Funny enough, at my high school, I think in my mom's house, they still have a magazine of like creative work that our high school Easy Glass put out, and I think a couple of my poems are still in there. And I remember looking at one of them a few years back, like when I was in grad school, trying to like quickly come up with like a poem for critique, because I was like, oh crap, I've only written like 3 poems and not like the 5 that I'm supposed to turn in. So yeah, I actually did go back and look at it. I don't know if I rewrote it word for word, but it's definitely interesting to kind of revisit old work and just either feel the immediate cringe or also like try to figure out what you were feeling at the time.
Yeah, I would think that would be an interesting to put yourself in your shoes as a younger self, and then revisit it as the older self. And how would the older self actually interpret, being a younger when you were younger?
Yeah. And I imagine that's the same thing for visual artists. You look at a piece you created like 5, 10, 15 years ago, and you're either like, oh wow, like finding the immediate flaws, or you're sometimes like, wow, I wish I could replicate that. And it's hard, I think, to revisit the same state of mind. Like no matter how many times you feel sad or angry or passionate about something, it's always going to be slightly different, just because life circumstances kind of deem it so. But I think there's a benefit to keeping some of that old cringy work anyway.
I think so. And interestingly enough, and I don't know if this is the same with writing. And as I was telling Meg earlier today, we had a project in grad school where we worked with the MFA poetry program at George Mason and the MFA artists. So we did something called call and responses, where the poets would give us a poem and we'd do a painting based on the poem, and then the painters would give the poets, and so it kind of back and forth. And when we talked, one of the requirements is that we had to sit down and talk process. And I was absolutely fascinated both times I did this exhibition twice, that we had the same process. It was like bizarre. It was I sat down with 2 different poets at 2 different times, and it was, when we started talking about process, it was very similar. And it's not what I expected. I figured the process would be different in some way, and it really wasn't. And so what I find, actually looking back at my older work, is sometimes I'll look at it and I'll say, oh, that's what you meant. I didn't quite at the time know what that piece meant at the time. Would that be the same for you in your poems?
Oh yeah, especially
back at them and
especially I think the written word, like, and this is applicable to like fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama, etc. That you, when you write something down, I think you always like subconsciously have like some other meaning to it, even if you don't realize it at the time. So yeah, that absolutely does happen. Like I'll be reading a poem I wrote like 5 months ago or 5 years ago, and just kind of be like, oh, so that's really like the topic I was trying to discuss, and maybe I just wasn't like mentally ready for it, so I tried to write it in a way where it wasn't like completely there. So yeah, absolutely,
Yeah,
it
it's
happens.
yeah, and for myself as a visual artist, I get this imagery that comes to me that I have to explore, but I don't really always know why at that time. You know, why do I need to explore this? And it's only, you know, during grad school you came up with a reason because you had to, but that wasn't always necessarily
Mhm.
what the reason was. And 5 years down the road, the reason, you look at the work and you're like, oh,
Yeah,
okay, I just wasn't ready yet.
yeah, that definitely happens in writing as well.
Mhm. So when that happens, do you revisit the work? I mean, I tend to revisit it when I finally understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have copies of like some journals I've been published in, and of course, like my chapbook, shameless plug in here. It got published in, God, I don't even know what year it is. 2018. So that was like what, 3 years ago? I mean, we all know time's a construct and nothing's real, but
Right.
3 years ago. And like just looking at it now, like when I started putting together those poems back in I think 2017 or something, it's crazy to think like how long it's been. And when I revisit these poems, I'm like, oh yeah, that's where I was trying to get at. Or, maybe it wasn't in its final form then. I think people have this misunderstanding that like when you publish a book, especially like with poetry, I'm not sure for like fiction or nonfiction, but with poetry, like there are other forms of that poem that exist like off the page. I think just because we're so used to like collections by like long dead writers that it's like the definitive edition of a poem. But a lot of times, especially contemporary day, a poem can exist in a one journal and be completely like edited differently into another like anthology, and then you have like the published book, so it's not just like this static form.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of like the reader and the writer's understanding of a poem can kind of shift, just because again, you're never really in the same state when you're reading something, whether you've read it again or it's your first time. So
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's sort of like I try to explain this to my students sometimes. Do you how do you see, like, artists actually create in like circles or spirals, coming around and back to similar themes over and
Mm-hmm.
over again throughout their career? It's just kind of like it's not linear, it's not
Mm-hmm.
static, but it does tend to overlap and repeat itself over time. How would you describe um, your process in that sense? Do you find it kind of moving around, repeating itself, and then moving on, or
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely themes I think I've always like have kind of gravitated towards writing about, whether it's like, religious identity or just like faith. I was raised Jewish and like a largely, prominently Christian city here in Lynchburg. And I do think that's like slowly changing. It's not like as bad as it was for me like growing up, but at the same time, it's just something that kind of stays with you. Same thing with like family relationships. But I also write a lot about emotions. I've been delving into like nonfiction, so I've been writing about like internet culture and kind of parasocial relationships and things like that. So I think you kind of think of it as like a tree, whereas the trunk is kind of like the main body of it that you keep like returning to, but then you kind of branch off into other little things where they still connect in some
oh,
way,
I
but they're
love
still
that
their
way you
own
say it. I'm going
branch.
to take that. Can I take that? Because I like the tree metaphor. I love the fact that the trunk and you go off on the branches, but you tend to
Yeah.
come back to the,
Yeah, absolutely. And
yeah.
it's all connected in some way to what you're interested in, as well as what like informs you and what kind of environment you're in. So, I wouldn't want to say like, oh, I only ever write about these three things, but it's more like I tend to write about these things that kind of inform like themes of whether it's a chapbook or, other essays or things. But, at the same time, I'm very interested in several other topics that I've been writing about. And I don't want to just completely discard that and just say, oh, well, it's not the main body of my work. Why should I write about it or something?
Right.
But it's probably an important branch, in which you have to explore, and you can always go back to the main kind of back to your trunk. Oh, I'm totally using that. Thank you. I'm appropriating that language because that is
completely okay. I'm sure someone out there has also used the same.
That's like the thing, right? Everything's already been done before, no matter what.
Why even try to do anything original? No,
that's not the attitude, but that's okay. Since you've touched on a lot of your subject matter being emotion and like family, life-based, faith-based, feminist, I would say, what is it like for you to open up and share that with people? I mean, any
like my family?
That. Well, I mean, you can share your family's reaction, but mostly like complete strangers, like when any artist has to put themselves out there. So how do you feel about that? How do you
it's always a little scary, I think, to be perceived. I'm sure any any artist, whether visual or written or like a screenwriter or stage play, writer, it's always a little scary to have like this thing that you created, like your child, and you're putting out into the world, and they're gonna like, oh my God, are they gonna judge it? It's like, that's an ugly child. That's an, this is a dumb poem. Well, I haven't gotten that response, but especially when it's like something so like deeply personal to you that you don't really like, you haven't even told people like in real life. Like I published an essay back in November about like fan fiction and internet culture, and that was like actually really scary for me to share because that was like such like a deeply personal thing that I never even like told my mom about. And of course now it's all funny and fine, and it was well received, but I think when you share things with people, you never really know what the reaction is going to be. And also, I think depending on where you live, I think it can kind of be hard to like share any sort of art when you're around people that you're not sure if they're going to quote unquote understand it. It's like the classic, like, going to the Contemporary Art Museum and people being like, oh, I bet I could do that, when it's just like, a thin black line where it's like, you don't know Bernard Newman's work. Like, go away. I think that's him, right? The one with the zip, the light.
You know
that. Former almost art history major here, so
yeah.
But yeah, I think when people, it's hard because they think, oh yeah, I can do that same thing, and kind of like belittle it in that way, or I don't understand it. You know what? I'd rather have people be like, I don't understand it, or as long as they don't like outright. I guess people are allowed to hate art. It's all subjective.
Yeah.
It's always like just a little touchy, but I've gotten better over the years of just being open with kind of the stuff that I do want to share, because otherwise why am I writing it? Like, yeah, I could write it for myself, but ultimately I want it for those pieces in particular to be out there in the world. So I couldn't like hold back on that.
Yeah, like any artist, any creative, we create because we want to get it out and we want to share it with people, because it's like a great way to connect with people that you may not even know who will see it and relate to that. And
I think poetry especially is becoming so much, because it's experiencing like an online boom in the last, I would say 5 years, 10 years even. Because, growing up, poetry you thought was like just written by dead white guys from, 100 years ago. And, you didn't really read any like contemporary poets that were, because they were all mostly in like academia. So you wouldn't read them until like maybe when you were in college or maybe late high school. But now, since there's so many people online, like just sharing their poems on like Instagram or Twitter or like online journals, where people traditionally didn't have access to like all the print journals to subscribe to. So I think that's the real like great part about like sharing a poem online, is that someone else will see it, someone that you don't know, someone who, maybe it's their first time reading a poem ever, or just, not something that was written. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like my boy Willie Shakes, but you kind of want to read something else that wasn't written like 500 years ago. So
and I bet having that community, just like having a printmaking community, having a painter community, makes sharing that way easier.
Just like having a community of not just writers, but like other artists, because I think poetry especially gets this really bad rap of being like the isolated, goth, moody writer, brooding writer crowd in the coffee shop, chain smoking outside at a cafe or something. That's not true, really. I mean, it can be intensely like private, but I think at the same time that kind of reputation doesn't do their writing any good because we all are informed by like musicians and painters and like other writers that aren't just like poets but like fiction and any composers, film, I think it's all connected in a way where you talk to people who have other interests that still read poetry. So it's not, again, not everyone is like, holed up in a room somewhere for 8 months, writing stuff. Not everyone is an Emily Dickinson. So, I think it's kind of a disservice to just assume that like poets by themselves are solitary creatures because I don't think that's true. If it were, then AWP wouldn't exist, and Lord knows that's a party.
Well, then, since most artists don't just deal with the medium that they choose to deal with, like I've done writing and I've done painting and printmaking and drawing almost as like my whole life I've been drawing and writing. So, is there other outlets? Brooke, I stole your question. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Are there other creative outlets that you've been doing this whole time along with your writing?
So yeah, I've gotten back into drawing in the past. I would say since the pandemic started, like when quarantine happened. I've been drawing just as long as I've been doing writing, and I drew quite a lot throughout middle and high school. Like a lot of anime stuff. Obviously, that was the thing, but like I still enjoyed it. And I was taking a lot of high school art classes, and I really, for a moment, wanted to be like an animator. So like a lot of my knowledge about like cartoons and stuff nowadays is like really like because I never went to like animation school or like art school or whatever, which jokes on me. I ended up going to an MFA, so it all worked out. It's like I've been visiting like charcoal drawing, especially, which I've always loved. I love like getting messy with like fine charcoal and like playing around with different types of like ash and charcoal that isn't just like traditional blocky charcoal. Like I started like burning matches and using that too.
Cool.
So that works. You can even go out and get a briquette from and I mean, especially if you want to go big, you can help yourself to a briquette.
Yeah, it's been a while since I try to like when I do charcoal drawings, I try to like spray, fixative outside because I hadn't done charcoal drawing in years since like the ventilation room at UC Glass. So it's been kind of nice to like revisit that and not have to be so pressured to write. Because I'll be honest, the pandemic was not very kind to me. Like the first 7, 8 months of it, I really didn't write all that much, but I began drawing again. And I'd like to get back into maybe painting at some point. I did some painting at Randolph for like an extracurricular, but I'd like to get back into that too. I think it's important when you feel like burned out in one subject, like whether it's writing or art, visual art, sculpting, like it's important to kind of exercise other parts of your brain so you're not just like forcing yourself to do something. It's different when it was like grad school and I'm like, okay, I have to have like 5 pages to workshop. And sometimes like the creative genius jumps out at the deadline, but when you have like all this time and you're not really sure how to, use it for writing, then, doing something like visual art, drawing, painting, a lot of people have taken up cross stitch. Every time I'm on like Instagram or Twitter, I see someone's new like cross stitch, sort of thing. And I'm like, maybe I should try that. And I'm like, I don't know, like I'm afraid of needles. So I think people are really like starting to lean into those hobbies that they may have like explored at one point before life got like too busy or something they were interested in. And then now with, the pandemic and like subsequent quarantine and people most likely working from home more, like and having all this time, I think it's been kind of a return to things that like we do for fun and not necessarily for productivity or for the sake of capitalism. Like again, I'm obviously artists got to sell art and eat food and make money, but at the same time, sometimes you just want something for like yourself. And that's, it's the same thing about poetry. There are definitely things I've written that I haven't shared with people, probably just because it's more of like a venting exercise.
Right, that's
But
like your sketchbook.
yeah,
Like,
Yeah.
but
not
especially with
everyone
like
sees.
drawing, I don't have, I'm not going to be like an animator. I'm not going to be like a, portraitist or whatever. But, it's been nice just to do something different and kind of think about, oh, wow, this is how I'm feeling. You exercise different parts. And I do think that that's what helps you return to your main art
Yeah.
subject of choice when you've explored other areas of yourself and you're like, oh, okay, well, now I feel better because I've drawn for, you know, several weeks now. And I think now I have something to come back to write about.
Yeah. And I think that as artists, we need to find balance.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just stick with one outlet, you're going to be out of balance.
Yeah.
So, for example, I paint, but during grad school, more than now, I did printmaking, and my printmaking was very minimal when my painting is not. And it's that constant search of balance in your making. At least for me, I need those two outlets, and I do cooking now. So I cook as well as doing my art, and that balances
Mm-hmm.
kind of the process of both. It creates that definite, and nobody sees my printmaking, and people see my cooking, but that's kind of different because they eat it. Um, so I think as artists, we always need to kind of balance our energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's like making something or in my case, like I've been trying to get back into reading. I bought a couple books over the past, I guess, year, a couple poetry books, a couple of like nonfiction. I've really been getting into a lot of nonfiction reading just to kind of, again, exercise the part of my brain. I'm sure when we're all in grad school and we're hyper focused on our one area. Like I read a lot of poetry in grad school. When I was out, I'm like, okay, I'm getting burned out.
Right.
Let me read some fiction. Let me especially read some nonfiction and just kind of learn about different things that way. But I've gotten back into reading poetry again. Bought a couple books over the past few months, and just finding my way back into that sort of you know not community, but more of a back in that practice again.
Yeah.
Excellent. Let's see. You know, I'm just curious. I mean, as a visual artist, we're always trying to get shows.
Mhm.
And so you send in your applications, and I imagine that is publishing to get published is at pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, you have submissions. So kind of like what I mentioned about not writing much, I barely submitted anything last year. I had that one essay published, but that was kind of a special case because that was technically solicited, and we spent several months like on edits and sending it back and forth because there's a lot more to nonfiction publishing than there is poetry publishing. So just like some basic fact checking and proofreading and like continually adding to things that were happening because of news. So that was more of an ongoing project. But with poetry, yeah, there's, you traditionally, like if you were going to, let's say you write some poems, if you're going to wanting to publish them, then a lot of journals usually have like guidelines where they want X amount of poems within an X amount of pages. They have like their traditional like waiting period. And then if you don't hear back, you bury them, obviously. It's definitely changed a lot from what I understand from like 20, 25 years ago, where you still had to like mail submissions in. I can't, God, I am so impatient. I probably would not have been a poet in the 80s or 90s. I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could do it, man. Waiting several months and like getting like your own work like rejected by mail.
Ouch.
In this day of instant gratification. But no, I mean, I've waited several months before, especially for like the big, like, I guess, quote unquote, like top tier magazines. Sometimes you wait up to a year, which I don't really submit to them anymore unless they like want me to work there. I mean, hit me up, New Yorker,
Oh, oh, I do. I love the New Yorker.
But, a lot of times, like, I just, submitting is a whole other process where you have to really be like mentally prepared for it. Because it's one thing to write the poem, but then to like figure out kind of what venues you want to send it to is equally. Like, I'm sure if you were, visual art, sometimes you don't want to send like a traditional still life, maybe to like a sci-fi focused magazine that wants like art. You know what I mean? Like that kind of, there are specifics, or like you don't want to send like a a concept art of like some cartoon show to, something that wants like floral, flower scenery, kind of like,
Yeah, no, you do. You tend to like oftentimes read through and yeah, exactly what you're talking about for shows. You kind of read who's curating it, what is the interest of that curator, and if that curator,
the museum, and that's the same thing for all journals, not just poetry, but like fiction and nonfiction. Now there are journals that are more open to like anything, that just want like your best work, but sometimes it's actually harder to like send stuff to those places because you're not really sure exactly what they want.
What do they want? They want something,
or like they have like, especially like literary journals kind of run the problem of like being like overly poetic even in their submission guidelines, where like we want work that crackles like fire, and I'm like, what does that mean? Like, I'm a poet but I have no idea what that means. Or like, we want it to glisten like a purple morning dew, and I'm like, I still don't know what that means, but okay. Like, do you want like image driven narrative poems? Do you want like surreal experimental work? Like, I have a poem I'm working on right now that's set in an Excel spreadsheet, and I'm still like trying to figure out where would work best, like probably an online journal, because it'd be kind of tricky to like format that for the print page. But at the same time, I'm like, well, who would accept this?
Oh, I think it's a fascinating idea, because now I'm going to sound like a visual artist. You're playing with your surface. And I never thought about that as a writer, like, because I play with surface all the time, and that's exactly what you're doing, is playing with the actual surface in which you're working on.
There's a lot of writers out there, not just poets, but writers who are experimenting with, different ways of how people read their work. At the literary magazine I run, we just, not just, but like we published within like recent years, so like a hybrid piece in which it was actually my co-editor had to code into the website for that publication, because it's like a scroll down drop down box. So you click on like an entry and it pops up with like a mini flash like piece. So like that was really fascinating, and I'm like, how do people think of this? Or like another poet that I really admire, Marissa Crane, they did like a Venn diagram hybrid fiction poetry piece where like the writing was within the Venn diagram circles, which is just like, how do you come up with this? Like, I can barely get 2 sentences down, and you're just out here creating forms. So there's so much that's being done with what you said, like surface and texture, and like how we communicate. Some things are better on a page, some things are better read out loud. Like, I have so much respect for people who do like slam and spoken word poetry. I don't concern myself, within those communities outright, but I love listening to how people can use their voice to emphasize or stress certain like syllables or words, and kind of like how there's certain things that you can't really put on a page and vice versa. And that's the same thing with art. There's installation art. You can't always put that in a gallery. Sometimes you have to be out in the field that it's in. Or, I mean, I guess if you want to be like that one artist who I think carpeted an entire gallery with like grass, I can't remember who did that, but there's like some environmental artist who did that. Or like the spiral jetty piece, so there's certain things that can't be replicated by like photograph or gallery wise. So I think creative people are always looking for ways to kind of expand beyond, I guess, the traditional constraints of their art. But again, there's nothing wrong with working within those constraints as well.
I know. There's something, because there's something comforting about working within the structure that has a history. You're working within a history of so many people who came before you, and I think there's some comfort in that history in which you exist in. I don't know, I look back at the Renaissance painters and the Baroque painters, and they are like, they were there first, but we're all painters, and having them is part of the story.
Yeah, definitely.
Painting is reassuring. Yeah.
Well, let's see. Is there a piece of poetry or prose that you are most proud of?
Oh, that's a loaded
I
question.
know it's like, what's your favorite child?
Yeah. I mean, my favorite children are my cats, but um, well, I guess in terms of like genres I've written in, I mean, obviously my favorite nonfiction piece is definitely the one about the fan fiction that I wrote. Like, yeah, I think I'm very proud of myself for crafting like a nonfiction essay that makes sense. Because with poetry, you can kind of play around with, you know, images and like you don't have to have like characters, so to speak. And then with the nonfiction, I had to like really, I still made it personal, but also kind of like detailed. You know, I had sources. I, you know, again, had to kind of like fact check myself and still deliver like a personal essay that also had a lot going on regarding, internet culture is still forever changing and shifting, and just so much having to do with how people perceive online writing. I guess with poetry, so that poem that I gave y'all to beat Burg like 2 years ago, the Daughterland poem, that was recently just accepted by QU Lit Mag, which is my graduate school's literary magazine. And I was like so happy that it finally got placed because it was had been rejected so many times. And it's just like one of my favorite poems that I've written. So I guess I'm pretty proud of that. And just, I'm working on a couple other things, poems, excerpts of, 700 word, like not quite essays, more just like brain, spewage that I'm trying to like contort into something readable. So yeah, I think it's always like kind of, I guess it's more like my favorite pieces of like a certain time, kind of like how, artists have like certain art movements or periods, like Picasso's blue era period, whatever, or like, how like people think Jackson Pollock only did the splatter paintings, and that's actually not true of his entire
right
work as a painter. Or again, like I it's hard, I think, to just kind of like nail down. It's more like I have favorite pieces from like certain times.
Right, that makes
But
sense.
yeah, I think I'm definitely, in terms of like most proud of like recently, I would say that Daughterland. Um, it goes to show that you can keep getting rejected, and then one day you're just going to bother enough people, and someone will finally accept
Yeah,
it. And you'll get paid for it too. So
hey,
yeah, that's always the plus. I mean, I write poetry not for the money, obviously, but it's nice to
it's always nice to
get some chai tea money, right?
get some paid. Yeah. So you've mentioned this article a couple times, and I really loved reading it because we are creatures of the same childhood, and we both read and wrote fan fiction, though you were brave enough to actually publish it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I still am not that brave.
Yeah.
Uh, so I'm always I'm always looking at like different fan art, fan fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that there's kind of like a debate on if it is legitimate art form.
Yeah, I think
So,
so.
yeah, cool. That
I
was
think
my
so. I
question.
think it gets tricky, I think, with fan art, because a lot of like artists who draw like fan art, they obviously can do commissions. It's a little different with like writing. I know from what I don't really peruse like those channels anymore, so to speak, but I do know sometimes people will be like, hey, can you write me a 1,000 word piece and about these characters or whatever? And I don't know. I think when people when writers like George R. R. Martin, or like other writers who like come down on like fan fiction, I'm like, well, dude, you were literally writing Lord of the Rings fan fiction. Like that's what Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones is. Or these other writers who seem to really like not care for it. It's just kind of funny to me, because I'm like, at some point we all have to start somewhere.
Right.
And again, originality is not in a vacuum. We all kind of borrow ideas. And even like a lot of like novelists now have kind of come forward with being like, yeah, I wrote fan fiction. I drew fan art back then, and it helped, kind of write. Now, obviously what you shouldn't do is like write fan fiction and then just pull an ELL James and like publish it. Cause I do find problems with that, especially, or like, Cassandra Clare, but, yeah, just certain writers who I think like self-plagiarize just so they can make money. Like, go get the bag, but also like don't make it so obvious. But yeah, I think it's valid. I think it helps a lot of people kind of figure out where their creativity kind of comes from and how they engage with their favorite forms of media. So absolutely, I think, and especially with, I think, poetry, you have like a lot of like pop culture poetry being published now, a lot of poems about like Star Wars, or just anything from like Tiger King to Jurassic Park to anything, like any sort of like anime, even, a lot of like a writer friend of mine published his chapbook about Pokemon.
Cool.
Like it's very like deeply personal and about his identity as a Black man, but it's also like dealing with like Pokemon, like entries and stuff. And I just find that so fascinating. And it's so funny when people try to be like, oh, that's not like high culture. And I'm like, well, I mean, freaking Canterbury Tales had fart jokes. Like,
right.
like, that one scene that everyone talks about, like there's always been like quote unquote pop culture and how we engage with it, as well as like fan fiction. It's, Paradise Lost is basically just Bible fan fiction and cantos. Like, John Milton was like, what if I made Lucifer hot? Like,
yeah, what if?
I mean, that's a little reductive even, but I think when people write stories based on their favorite shows or books, or when they write, or they draw like their favorite characters, they're engaging with media, and that's really what it's meant to do, right?
Right.
Any sort of TV show or movie or book or web series, even, it's meant to entertain, but also create its own narrative with people and have it reflect onto them. So yeah, I think it's legitimate, and it shouldn't be like completely shamed. I only find issue again if it's like, self-plagiarizing just to get money, or when you copy, like, again, plagiarize another writer. So that's really my only issue with that.
Right. Well, we're pretty much on the same page.
So it seems like it can be a nice entry. I think poetry as a visual art, there's a stigma attached to it. And I think sometimes when you're working in like a genre that is more approachable, if you start with the familiar with people,
mm-hmm.
I mean, that can bring in people who would ordinarily not feel comfortable reading your writing, and then you can put your own thoughts and feelings into it, but you've created like a bridge or a door that people can enter through, and it's a door they feel comfortable walking into, when actually you're also introducing them to your ideas and thoughts.
Yeah, I think poetry again has this bad rap of being, unapproachable and, just boring, or like a lot of people saying, I don't get it. And there's nothing, again, wrong with that first impression of like, well, oh, I don't really understand this. And a lot of time I do blame like schools, like especially public schools, for like this idea of like you have to explain everything in a poem, or like, this means XYZ, or, again, like rehashing the same 5 poems that you only ever learn. And obviously that's not true of every single like person who's read poetry in school, but for me especially, it wasn't until I got to like college that I actually expanded my reading pool and didn't just read poems by dead white guys, but like contemporary poets and like non-white poets, and poets of any, like trans poets, or poets of any sort of sexual orientation. So yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that I find interesting is the whole Instagram poetry like thing. Rupi Kaur, who writes those very like simplistic, simple like poems. I have, again, get the bag, get your money. Like, I think any person who finds value in reading poetry, no matter where it's from, no matter who wrote it, that's still them reading it. Like, as much as I hate Twilight, example, the book, like at least it got people reading. I don't agree with Twilight. I think Stephanie Meyer's not a very good writer, but you know, at least it got teens of that time reading, because, you know, the last time that really happened with that phenomenon was Harry Potter, and well, look at it now. But
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why I love Bob Ross.
Yeah, definitely.
Bob Ross got so many people painting.
And still, you know, people still watch his videos.
To this day, he makes painting accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
And
that's what I really care about, is accessibility, especially to poetry. You know, I'm not like, again, I feel like one of the problems right now, I guess, in the poetry community is that there is a lot of like gatekeeping in terms of like prizes and submission fees. And I understand to an extent that, you know, magazines have to keep running. There are, you know, for example, poetry publishing, especially like a whole book. Like, I'm very lucky that with my chapbook, it's through an independent press and that he doesn't charge submission fees. You know, I'm very thankful for that. But there, in case a lot of like university run presses that have like contests like once a year, and you have to pay like anywhere from like $15 to $25 for a manuscript. And, you know, you think that's not bad. And sometimes you get like a copy of like the winning book or whatever, or like if it's a contest for like an individual set of poems, like they'll give you a print copy. But a lot of times just like you're wasting so much money. Like, I've known people who've written poems and then sent them in and have like kept track of like their submission fees, and it's like in the hundreds.
Yeah.
I'm sure mine's probably maybe in the hundreds. I don't know. I think the last year and a half I haven't really submitted anywhere that costs money, but yeah, I don't mind paying like a $3, you know, tip jar fee sort of thing. But I do find problems with when it's pretty evident that like a press, or especially a university or institution run press, charges you, and there's not much of like a transparency as to why.
Right.
You know, that's what I do find issue with. And especially because it keeps out like poets that are not like of a certain socioeconomic class, or like, you know, a lot of times like, you know, poets who aren't white or cisgender or whatever. So, you know, I do have my problems with that, but, you know, at the same time, I understand why submission fees kind of have to exist in some form, just so they can keep it running. But, you know, yeah, it's, I'm not a huge fan of things costing money.
Yeah, well,
and that's the same thing with art, I bet, especially when you have to like either mail your artwork, or even if you have to send like a PDF of it, sometimes they still charge you. So
they charge you. Oh yeah. It's about 3 pieces submitted for anywhere from $35 to $50.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing. You end up all of a sudden, I'm sorry, but those add up after a while. Those $35, those $50, they really do add up. And then they, you know, and I'm talking as somebody who, we're the same way. We have a jury show, we charge that much money. But it actually it goes for a nonprofit. It goes back into our operation.
Yeah, it's one of the prizes, basically.
Yeah, we desperately need it. But then, like, we can't afford, the artists have to pay for their own shipping. We can't afford shipping, and shipping is hugely expensive.
Oh yeah.
But I know a lot of poets who self-publish.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done any self-publishing or thought about self-publishing?
No, but I know a lot of poets who do. And you know what? Again, every avenue is different. I've definitely like thought about like self-publishing, like a lot of, especially because that's where a lot of like indie presses start, is like writers who are like, hey, you know what? I'm not going to deal with like the big 5 publishing house, and not just like poetry, but like any sort of press. Like, they want to be able to curate their own portfolio of writers they want to represent, especially because this is how like a lot of, again, like non-white, you know, writers get published, or anyone that's not of like traditionally, you know, from the Iowa Writers Workshop sort of thing. Yeah, I have absolutely. It's a hard deal. I know one of my graduate school friends does a lot of like self-publishing for romance novels, and she hustles harder than like most people. She's her own marketer, photoshopper, you know, in touch with like artists to help like create her covers, and I have respect for that. You know, I don't. I think the problem with like a lot of like people and how they perceive self-publishing is because a lot of like academic jobs don't accept that, or like it looks bad. And I'm like, well, look, like if you can self-publish on like Amazon or use like a print on demand service, like go for it. I just haven't really done it at this time for myself just because I'm not like actively like publishing like manuscripts right now. But yeah, I respect it. I think it should be more legitimized. Yeah, especially since I'm not going into the academic field. So to me, it's not lost. Like if I decide to self-publish or if I keep publishing with smaller presses, because that's not like my ultimate goal isn't tenure track like professorship.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the competition's definitely getting harder and harder, and those presses, sometimes unfortunately some indie presses or even like well-established presses like shut down, and it's making it harder and harder to kind of find places that would publish your work. So that's kind of always in the back of my mind too.
Well, I think as long as people are making poetry, there will probably always be at least someone trying to get it published. So all the tried and true ones may eventually see
and I think
but new ones will replace them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's really something to be said about the tenacity of like indie zines, especially like the underground zines of like the 80s and 90s, like kind of scene. So I have a lot of respect for people who do that because it really is like a labor of love. And especially with my press, Glass Poetry Press, like it's a one-man operation. It's Anthony just with a nice printer and does all like the like layouts, and I was lucky to have my friend design the art for my chapbook, but a lot of times it's usually like up to the writer to be like, hey, I like this piece of artwork, or sometimes you find an artist and you're like, can we pay you to use this image for the cover? So it's a lot more of, like, I like indie presses because you have more control over your work, whereas if you publish, let's say if I published a novel with Simon and Schuster, I guess, right? Yeah, just that's gonna happen. I've materialize in the future. You don't always have control over like the layout of the book. You don't have control over the cover image a lot of times. You don't have control over sometimes who blurbs it even.
Oh, wow.
Like, you just go through so many edits with so many different people. So sometimes it's like, is that really worth it at the same time? Or they're like, we like this, but change everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get to. I've done cover art for a self-published poet who liked my work and asked me if I'd give her one of my paintings for her book. And I can tell you, I certainly didn't charge her. It was an honor to be on the cover of her book of poems.
Yeah, same with my friend. I asked Stormy if she wanted anything, like, because my publisher was willing to pay her like a small stipend, and she's like, no. I'm like, are you sure? She's like, yeah, just give me Starbucks. I'm like, okay, like I fully believe in paying people. Like,
no, it's a huge, I think, honor to be asked. Honestly. And then I always like to see like an artist-run gallery. I'm always more happy sending my work to an artist-run gallery than the big guys. Who like the smaller the better. So I imagine that since artists are trying to take over more and more control of their work, and we're seeing that digitally with the NFT, and a lot of musicians are doing that as well, so they can have complete control over their work. They're selling through NFT, so they retain all of their rights. And of course, we're seeing that with digital artwork and the whole market that's appearing digitally. Have you been watching that phenomena?
Just being around on the internet with like Twitter, I think there's a lot of like qualms about NFTs. Not just like the environmental impact, but just like, to me, I don't like it when like tech bros or Silicon Valley bros kind of like get a slice of like whatever medium, like whatever media they want, just because I'm like, I don't know, this seems kind of fishy.
That's how I feel about it. I'm like hearing everybody's going that direction. I'm like, wait a minute. And environmentally, it's horrible.
Yeah, it just, to me, I'm just like, why? Like, I don't understand Bitcoin. I don't care. I'm just like, is it fake digital money? Like, is it like Neopets money? Like,
oh yeah, I made the Neopets joke when like that first started appearing. Yes.
Yeah, like, is it just I don't care to understand it. I try to know enough just so I know how to navigate the conversation, but I'm just like, I don't, to me, like, yeah, there's a valid points to be made about how you can make art digitally more accessible and, pay for it in that way. But I don't think like cryptocurrency or like crypto anything was the answer. Again, I don't trust anything that like
Well,
tech.
you kind of touched on it, like you're making it digitally accessible, but like the minute you say cryptocurrency, my brain goes blank because that is
Yeah.
just something I will never have as a normal person who just like has
Or Bitcoin.
no
Like you always get like those bots on like Instagram or Twitter that's like Bitcoin trader, DM
right.
me for more. I'm like, no, thank you. Like I'm not gonna be a brand. Like
No. So like I think what it is bringing attention to art and making it accessible to more people, but like buying it is even more inaccessible in my brain because I'm like, I don't even know how much a Bitcoin is off the top of my head. And I don't even think I'll own that much money, period.
yeah.
So I'd rather just buy physical art
Yeah, or
and
if you
have
can't
it.
buy it like physically, at least boost or support that artist by like
Right.
sharing their work, or
Send
if you
it to
do buy it,
someone who you
yeah,
know will like it too.
or review it. Like if you, I'm sure this is the same for visual art. Like if you go to a gallery, mention it, like, oh yeah, I just went to this gallery. Once everybody's been vaccinated, we're all open up, and it's not, just like sharing it that way, or buying their merch if you can't like
yeah.
afford something. And that's the same thing with poetry. Like if you can't buy someone's book, like a lot of times actually there's like cool like GoFundMe sort of things where like someone's like, I will, like a voucher almost, like I'll pay for the first, if someone can't afford like my book, I'll just send it to them, no questions asked. And I've done that a few times. Because I think it's important, especially for people who can't always access. Yeah, I think because my book's only like $8 ish.
Right.
But like $8 is a lot for some people still, and I think it's important to kind of do what you can. If you can't afford it, then yeah, have more of a community that supports that and wants to provide for those who can't always access, can't always buy journals. And that's kind of like my my ongoing, vendetta against like print journals that don't even like share like some of their works online when you want to submit to them. I'm like, I'm not paying money for this. Like, sorry. It seems like a lot of money if you're not going to even show like a sample poem of something you've published in the past year or two. Like,
Yeah, it's tricky. Have you ever read Barth, Death of the Author?
Roland Barthes, yeah.
How do you feel about when you let go, when you put your art out there, kind of his premise, which is marginally ludicrous in some ways, but I think
Well, yeah,
also,
and a lot of people take it in the wrong direction. I even mentioned that in that essay, that like death of the author. I'm like, that's not necessarily what it means. I think a lot of people just think of it as like removing the biographical element, and that's not. We all know that's not what he means, but that's where a lot of people tend to.
Yeah, they take it in that direction.
Yeah, like I think art is a product of its own making. That like no matter how distant you are from your own work, the text also stands as its own vehicle and is going to, kind of like what I talked about earlier about subconsciously, like when you write something or draw something, there's always going to be like that element that you didn't notice that other people are going to notice. So that's absolutely valid. And I think when you make, no matter how many times, even with printmaking, you make the same print over and over 100 times, there's always going to be a slight difference, or like like a smear, or a
registering is not always exact. So
yeah, exactly. So I think that's the same thing with putting your work out there, is that no matter where it goes or how many times it's shared or when it's posted, there's always going to be some sort of different understanding of it. But yeah. It's again almost former history major here. Yeah, a lot of Wittgenstein. And
you're talking to two people who like to just name drop artists back and forth, so we can hang with our history people.
And that's the same thing with writers too.
Right.
We can't. Well, you're talking to somebody who in graduate school we were sitting around, and we spent a lot of time sitting around, I can tell you. talking, and everybody was like, "Who's your favorite poet?" And we went around, and everybody said who their favorite poet is, and they got to me, and I said, "Oh, A. Milne." I love I love A. Milne. It makes me happy. I love when we were, yeah,
Winnie the Pooh, yeah.
yeah. I mean, he wrote. Have you read his poems when we were very young?
Um, I mean, I know Winnie the Pooh.
Oh, you have to read his poems. His poems are fantastic. They're funny and engaging, and
You need funny poems. You need, people have this belief, and,
clever.
a lot of like, I always joke that I'm like, my poems aren't that, I'm gonna write a happy poem, and I'm like, oops. But like, it's the same thing with fiction. No one says, I guess the closest thing to fiction is like, oh, it's just autobiographical, because a lot of times like the debut novel is usually like an autobiographical slash like roman plot sort of thing. There's poems of all different types, like wedding, happy poems, nature poems, poems about, again, anime characters,
And there's a place for them. I was a lucky little kid because every night my father my father would let me choose. It's one of those huge anthologies of poetry, and every night we'd open it and go, this one. And every night for years and years and years, I heard a poem.
That's important. Yeah, my mom had a copy of Robert Louis Stevenson's poems, I think like A Child's Garden of Verses, and she would read that to me.
Yeah.
A lot of other, I think nursery rhymes even are like early poems.
Poetry.
They're easy to remember, they rhyme. You don't really get like the traditional rhyming poem nowadays in contemporary poetry because it can feel a little contrived and like forced, but you can still rhyme in ways where it's not like, A B A B A B.
Yeah.
Kind of pattern.
Yeah, and I think if you grow up listening to poetry, and poetry is part of what you hear, it takes away some of the stigma.
Yeah, and just poem, like, people often, I remember a lot of people's like introduction to poetry was through deaf poetry, like by Mos Def, which I know he doesn't go by like that name anymore, but I'm missing what is.
I don't think I know him by any other name.
Yeah, Mos Def. I need to look. It's worth a Google. Like,
it's worth a Google.
Yeah, Yassine Bey. Yeah, better known by his stage name, Mos Def. Yeah. So like a lot of people were introduced to like poetry that way, and a lot of like rap and R&B, and a lot of songs are poems, like lyrics. Yeah, again, like I'm not going to judge someone who has like their introduction to poetry through their lyrical stuff. I think that's great. I'm not going to think that's a lower form. Like, I think there's a reason why people still listen to Tupac.
Right.
a lot of his verses are still very real and very like complex. So yeah, I think if when you're exposed to it in not just like the traditional way when you're younger, or when you have like the Amanda Gorman reading her poem at the inauguration, like that's really powerful. The fact that like like her book was like sales exploded and she had like this online presence all of a sudden. And I think that's a good way to like introduce people who may not traditionally have been drawn to poetry, but having that such a national stage, or having like poet laureates of cities and states, and like obviously the US. So I think there's ways to do that, and again, just like having more contemporary poets being read in schools, but I think also kind of combat that whole like it's just all dead and no one understands it, or like maybe instead of like forcing people to read a poem and figuring out what it means, just being like, what does it mean to you?
Right.
And like of course you're always going to have like the Shakespeare, the Coleridge, and there's nothing, obviously, I mean, I still love Yeats, I still love Keats, but you can also introduce like newer writers who take those traditions and kind of introduce it that way, so you're not entering this world of literature where everything's of a certain type. And I do wish like growing up I had like, especially in high school or like early college, I wish I could have been exposed to more poets of all varieties and backgrounds and ethnicities, and not having to discover them through later in college or grad school. But I guess that's what the online community is there for. It's just finding things out that process. And I'm sure the same thing is for traditional art too, like you study all the French dudes and
the Dutch dudes,
the Dutch
French
dudes,
dudes,
Spanish
Italian
dudes. I mean, Velasquez is still like a king though. Like you can't touch Diego Velasquez, like
True.
Or Bacon. This
yeah.
That would be interesting to write some poetry on a Bacon.
I mean, ekphrasis, when you were talking about the call and response, I mean, ekphrastic poetry is basically a poem that you write based on any sort of art,
Mm-hmm.
So that does exist. I mean, I'm sure people have written poems about paintings. I know there are collections that center around it. I'm blinking because I can only remember 3 things at a time. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, one of those things is going to be Francis Bacon.
You already got the 2 names, so there was no room for anything else.
Oh no, I was like, the minute you said Bacon, I was like, whoa.
I mean, because Bacon was basically poetry. His painting was, especially like of the Pope, like that was a direct response to Velasquez.
Oh yeah, I mean, he took from he appropriated from other artists to create his own.
You have poets who were inspired by like the 80s, graffiti, street art, like Basquiat, for example. That was a huge, Keith Haring, huge influence on like writing culture at that time. So, it's creativity and art isn't just in one, like we said, isolated place. It impacts everything. So, when people are writing poetry, you think about like the images, like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, and you look at the art at the time, you're like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. There's always different movements and different explorations of a subject and, medium and how that relates in other areas of culture.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at the Dada movement. Dada was across the board: visual arts, poetry, music. I mean, it's that's one of the things that's sort of a problem, that we're all so spread out now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is we don't have the cafe where you have all the artists of different mediums coming together and talking.
Yeah, like the salon sort of.
Yes, which I think we actually need. I think it would be good to bring back those times where you have.
Be good for Lynchburg too, especially.
Yeah, just have artists come together and.
I mean, that's something I'm definitely going to try to start planting when I start my new job at the academy.
Ooh, would you plant that, please? That we had like some and keep us at Riverviews in on this. Where we have times in which we gather together artists of all mediums, and we all just sit down and have coffee. We're coffee with curators, so there's no reason why. I mean, why we all couldn't sit down and talk about, what we're thinking, what's going on, and
I think it'll be interesting to see how writing and art is. I mean, obviously, it's being impacted now by COVID-19 and all these things. So it'll be interesting to see what it looks like 10 years from now, or how people are reflecting on it. Same thing with what happened with cholera, or the 1918 flu, or everything. When people are like, don't write or don't show media about COVID right now, I'm like, I understand why it feels still a little bit like new. Like it's weird to see like shows or movies where they want to have like the mask on. I think we're not like emotionally or mentally distant enough yet to kind of watch that. But at the same time, I'm like, obviously writers and artists were writing and drawing and painting during times of crisis. Like it happens, that's just how people react to things. So at the same time, I'm like, it's human nature to respond to things in creative ways.
My gosh. And in all of our podcasts, we ask artists how they've been, doing during COVID. Fascinating to hear the responses. Some artists are super productive, making all sorts of work, and then there are, as you spoke about, there are some of us, I think myself included, who we just kind of couldn't make work.
Yeah, and it really depends on that person individually, as well as like what kind of mental space or physical space they're occupying. Like again, like it's just been now that I've been able to kind of go back to writing things a little bit more. And, I think drawing through the past year has definitely helped with still being creative. But, I think we all hit dry spells, and when something of this nature happens on such a global scale, it does kind of depress the person, not in terms of like depression, but like it depresses and like doesn't make you want to produce anything
to do any work. So I think there's going to be the artist who is able to work during the pandemic, and I think there are going to be a lot of artists who need space from it, but then we'll start dealing with what they were feeling at the time, and they just couldn't do it at the time. They needed space on.
Well, and I hope that with advances in technology, like I think there's been way more like online poetry readings. In fact, I'm part of a reading in a panel this month, so woohoo! So that traditionally, you'd have to go to like a convention, like AWP or NOLA Poetry to like see these people in person. But now with like Zoom and Google Meet and everything else, like now there's a way for people to tune in where they're from the comfort of their own home. They don't have to like pay anything really. There's more people just doing stuff like online and making it more accessible. So I really hope that continues. And the, even when we're all vaccinated and things are quote unquote, moved on, wink.
I think it will. I mean, Meg and I both went to studio visits in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
And we run around. It was virtually. We'll run around and met a whole bunch of contemporary artists in their studios in working in D.C. And I can't imagine it was so successful. I think that's going to be part of the future.
Definitely.
Yeah, as well as at home. I know the Academy was doing a lot of virtual classes. So I'm really excited to see where the Academy continues with that, because that was something I brought up when I accepted the job. So I'll be working really close to you guys.
Yeah, right on the corner.
I'm so excited. I start on the 12th, so about over a week. But yeah, that's something I definitely want to see continued in Lunch for Artists, just virtual classes, as well as just how can we take the lessons we've learned from virtual ideas and COVID and just push it for the future. So that way, it would be nice to have like full house theaters and music shows again. But, in the meantime, how can we better serve a community? And that's the same thing for Riverviews Artspace, as to how can we provide the same level of, curated artworks and studio visits and whatever. But for people who may not be local or may not even be in the state of Virginia,
Well, we've been so grateful for like any artists who last year in particular, we had people from like one of them moved to Colorado in the middle of planning the exhibit and he was still down to show. Like we had people, we extended a whole show like months, and all these different people were like, yeah, just, keep it in place and let people see it. And we threw everything on the website to get people to see the shows. So we couldn't have shown anything if it wasn't for the artist willing to show in a pandemic.
I think artists and writers understand that. Like, again, the good ones anyway. Like, nobody with an ego.
But
yeah, absolutely. But I'll be excited to kind of see where things go in the next several months. I mean, once I just got the jab yesterday, and yeah, my arm's still kind of hurting, but that was just the first dose. I've heard the second one's kind of a doozy. So
yes,
yeah, I got mine on Friday. I'm much better than I was Saturday.
The
so I'm kind of glad I got
out
at least
for a day. So
I'm glad I at least got this one before I started my job, and then the next one I think is also the same day, like a few weeks from now. So at least I can kind of have a weekend to, if it's really bad, whatever. But and even then, like I'm not gonna like go out and rip off a mask party. Like I'm not that stupid. Like I look forward to the day where we can all be in a museum gallery space together. Having a poetry reading live, but also like a virtual one, or just doing things that can reach people of all backgrounds and situations and living places. Because, art's not a one size fit all community, and it shouldn't be. It should be expandable and flexible and, you know.
And accessible, and and honestly, so much of art, we price people out. They just
Yeah,
can't afford it.
writing is definitely like that too. I mean, AWP, one of those literary conferences I just talked about, I've been to 3 of them. It's expensive, especially depending on the city that you go to. I mean, my first one was in DC, which was fairly affordable because I could drive up there. But like, I went to the ones in Tampa and Portland in the past few years, and that was expensive. And it was totally fun, but it was also just godly expensive. And then, of course, they had one in San Antonio last year, which was right at the start of the COVID thing. So, like, they still had it. Thankfully, no one I knew who went got COVID, but like, it was in those early days where like nobody really knew. It was like, oh, it's just gonna be like over in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So it, and this year it's virtual, but I'm not going because why? But it would be nice to one day have like a physical place to, meet and hang out with other artists and writers. But at the same time, I think we just would be more aware that people can't financially afford those things. And same with artists, like they can't just drop everything, especially if they're like married or have kids or like other obligations. They can't just drop everything for like a week and just head out to Oregon or head out to, whatever big city and spend hundreds of dollars on rooming. And even if you get like a room with 4 other writers, which is what I did the last time I went.
Good strategy.
I mean, it definitely saved money, but it was also, it's just not really conducive towards like being like savings friendly,
Mm-hmm.
There's so much money to be made in that type of field. I'm like, really? Like the real people who are making money are like the conference organizers, not the
Yeah, very often that's the case.
Yeah.
Even with like conventions for artists. So
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we have to go. I'm so off script. It's not even funny.
I think we asked every question. I've been trying to follow along.
I've been.
I had a good time talking. I think
I have been all over the place here.
That's kind of the point of this, though. Like it's like we're supposed to be having coffee with you.
We're not going to be reading ad copy for Me Undies or whatever.
I will if they sponsor, but not until then.
Yeah, or like a whatever sponsored Casper. Like I was watching.
It's usually Casper, MeUndies, or like Skillshare.
Skillshare is a big one. Well, that's like for YouTube, I've noticed. Like, and sometimes I don't mind if it's like related to their topic, but sometimes I'm like, really, you're doing like Raycon for like this video on like fashion? I'm like, I don't know. Seems kind of sus, but
maybe Fortnite will sponsor us. I'll have to do an ad read first.
Can Minecraft sponsor us?
I wish.
Have a virtual art gallery in Minecraft,
Okay, but some of us have tried that, so
I know I'm getting older. I'm like, I don't even know what you TikToker Minecrafters like. Is that still a thing? Like, Twitch Discorders. Like, my sister's on Discord, and I'm like, what is that?
I don't know if people still. I'm sure people still play Minecraft, but there are more options than just Minecraft.
So it's just Fortnite now.
And Among Us.
Yeah, kids. I'm already starting to feel like those grandmas on the front porch being like, kids these days. Back in my day, we only had, LAN servers and Neopets and Gaia Online. Like that's all we had.
Yeah, we had the dial tone when we wanted to log on if someone was on the phone.
Yeah, or the AOL dial up.
Log it into DOS. Let's do that again.
Yeah. I mean, it'd probably be more secure now.
That's actually the key. We just need to revert back to DOS. Well, thanks, Hannah. I think we covered a large variety of topics.
I love talking about anything that's even not related to writing. So whether it's us, talking about NFTs and how bad they are to, fan art and fan fiction, anime, and everything else, and poetry, of course, and writing, then that's fine with me. I think it's good to have a large berth of interest.
Oh, absolutely. it's basically the whole theme of this podcast that we just talked about was just
no
don't
poet
put
should be
all your
like,
eggs in a basket.
no poet should be like, my only identity is just poetry. I'm like, that's not me. I contain multitudes, as our boy Whitman would say.